now have multicellular organisms. It's not that simple. I'm simplifying the situation here, but I don't see any conceptual problem with that kind of thing. Incidentally, this duplication or addition of information, I did say that polyploidy duplicates information. Then mutations come in and they change that information, which means that when you add together the process of polyploidy, which is chromosomal duplication, plus mutations, you have actually created new information, contrary to what you just said.
Okay. You mentioned, read the question one more time so I get to phrase it right. I hate to keep doing this to you, but this is my point-by-point argument again. Let's go point-by-point next time.
I'm sorry, can any known organism be traced back all the way to one cell?
Can any known organism trace back all the way to one cell? If you mean as far as evidence that it evolved from a one-celled creature, absolutely not. What he gave was a far cry from an example of evolution. The human being starts off as one cell and becomes a man. That is because it's following a genetic code. If that's your example of evolution, you're either confused about what evolution is, or you're trying to, again, grossly oversimplify this process. Everything comes from one cell. That is because there's a code it's following, and there's an enormous intake of energy. To get my son from one cell to 22 years old and 6 foot tall took a huge amount of food. There was energy put into this thing. So that is not evolution. If you're teaching your students that that's an example, going from one cell to a fully grown human, that's an example of evolution, you're deceiving your students because it's following a complex genetic code and it is taking in information from the outside. That is not an example of evolution like taught in the textbooks. And by the way, where are the two-celled creatures in the world? It would have to go, there are millions, zillions of one-celled creatures. Where are the two-celled or the three-celled or the four-celled? They don't exist, folks, and he ought to know that. They don't exist. There are colonies that get together and do functions, Volvox and stuff like that, but that's a colony of cells. Each one is still an individual cell. That's not anything similar to a tissue or an organ, and there just aren't any. Evolution falls flat. And you talk about Hume's dictum. You're claiming that all life forms came from one cell. You better have some extraordinary evidence of that.
What about divinely inspired evolution?
What about what?
Divinely inspired evolution.
Divinely inspired evolution. I would say that would be a retarded God that has to use evolution. First place, there's no evidence for evolution anyway, so why should I compromise a perfectly good Bible which has never been proven wrong with a dumb theory which has never been proven right? I wouldn't want to make that trade-off. And plus, I would not worship a God that has to use suffering and misfits and death and blind chance and doesn't know what he wants. The God that I worship made it right first time. No mistakes.
You said that your son grew up thanks to a lot of energy. Doesn't that violate the second principle of thermodynamics? Shouldn't have been annihilated by the energy coming in? That was a joke. Thank you. Okay, the question was about what?
The question simply said, what about...
It's fun, by the way.
Divinely
You should try one of these days.
What about divinely inspired
divinely inspired evolution. Well, I don't know, but you sure could be. Yeah, you can make the argument that that kind of God would be fairly wasteful. But then again, you know, who are we to make the argument about God's wastefulness or not? I think that was one of your objections before. So maybe we don't know. Maybe that is the best way that God can make things, and that's the way it happened. I have no idea. Again, evolution's got nothing to do, evolutionary biologists have nothing to say about theology. If you want to believe it that way, that's fine. There's plenty of evolutionary biologists. There's a colleague of mine, Dr. Miller at Brown University, who believes exactly that. He's written a book, if you're interested in that, called Finding Darwin's God or something like that. And that's the theory that he proposes. That's fine, but that you should know, reading the book, that that's not evolutionary biology. That's his version of theology. Maybe right or not.
Dr. Pigliucci, why do animals and humans not evolve today?
They do. I tried to explain it several times. Yes, they do. Animals and humans change their genetic constitutions all the time, every day. Therefore, they are evolving by definition. Now, the question might be, why is it that we don't see species appearing every time, every day? That's a good question. The answer to that is because the speciation process is actually pretty slow, as Darwin did propose. But as I said before, we have observed historical events of speciation, so that's not a problem for evolutionary theory either. And incidentally, talking about Darwin and quoting in a, shall we say, a selective way, that passage from Darwin, from The Origin of Species, that said it may seem absurd that to believe that the eye evolved by natural means. You should have smelled a rat there. The word was, it may seem absurd. You should know that if you go and check that quote, immediately afterwards, Darwin goes on into half a chapter in which he tries to explain how, in fact, the eye evolved. So he says, you know, at first view, it might seem like an absurd thing, but here it is how, in fact, it can happen, and this is what evolutionary biologists has found so far. Selective quoting is pretty dangerous.
Well, we're going to be here all week. Here's the quote. I have the book in the car. I'll get it out next time. He said, to suppose that the eye, with all of its intricable mechanisms for adjusting to light, he has a whole bunch of descriptions of the eye in there, could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. Go ahead and read the rest of page 217, 218, and 219, where he talks about his theory of how it might have happened, but it's all speculation. That's not science. Here's how it might have happened. That's what you did. Well, it might have happened, you know, from a one-spotted critter. I'm sorry, that's not science. As far as, was the question about why don't we see animals and humans evolving today? Is that the question we're discussing now?
Why do animals and humans not evolve today?
Well, because God designed them to bring forth after their kind, and that's all they're going to do. Humans are always going to have humans. You might get a big one or a little one, but it's always going to be a human. That doesn't happen. Evolution doesn't happen. So to me, I don't have a problem with that question.
Dr. Hovind, did you teach evolution when you were a teacher in high school? Were you a Christian then?
I was a Christian. I became a Christian at age 16. As I taught school, I taught science, and I tried to teach all sides of the theory. If evolution was presented in the book, I would say, here's one theory. Now here's the evidence against this theory. Here they're telling the kids, you know, you have similar bone structures in your arm compared to a whale. Okay. They can interpret that to be proof of a common ancestor, or you can interpret that to be proof of a common designer. The hubcaps from a Honda Accord will fit on a Honda Prelude. That proves they both evolved from a Chevy 84 million years ago. No, they have similarities because we have a common designer. That's just obvious. So I taught my kids to study science objectively, realistically. Let's look at this, and don't get brainwashed. Don't get taught what to believe. You know, learn how to really think about this. Somebody tells you the human embryo has gill slits, and that proves it used to